So it is my distinct honor to pin now and invite Rabbi Dr. Josh Garroway. Josh, how are you? You are good. It is so good to have you here. Josh is one of my very favorite professors that I had in rabbinical school. He's also a great friend. He serves as the Saul and Arlene Bronstein Professor of Judeo-Christian Studies and Professor of Early Christianity and Second Commonwealth at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion Skirball campus in Jack H. Skirball campus in Los Angeles. Rabbi, I thought that I had the longest. Rabbi Steinberg, that's for you. I thought I had the longest title in the world, but I think Rabbi Dr. Garroway actually holds that. I need to spotlight him. There we go. Rabbi Dr. Garroway earned his doctorate from the Religious Studies Department at Yale University and was ordained at the Cincinnati campus of HUCJIR in 2003. His first book, Paul's Gentile Jews, Neither Jew nor Gentile, but both, explores the ways in which Paul's epistle to the Romans constructs Jewish identity and the role played by this construction in the ensuing emergence of Christianity. He's also written another book and is currently working on a book-length project about antinomianism in Jewish history. That seems pretty exciting. So, Dr. Garroway, we are thrilled to have you here and to teach all of us. And take it away, my friend. Great. Thanks, Josh.
All right. So what we're going to talk about is Inside the Mind of God, Plato and the Rabbis, which sounds super highfalutin and academic. I promise you that I will try to bring this down to the ground, and you'll actually understand what that means platonically when we're done. And I promise you that you'll be able to walk away with two things. The first is you will know what God thinks about. Now, I'm not making any kind of objective claim about what God thinks about, but you will know what God thinks about, at least in terms of the way the rabbis, the founders of modern Jewish tradition, thought God thought about, and the way that early Christians, what they thought that God thought about, and the way early Jewish and Christian philosophers understood what God was thinking about. So you'll be able to tell people what God thinks about. The other thing I promise you'll take away from this is that you will never read the first line of the Torah in the same way ever again. The first line of the Torah, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning, or at first, God created the heavens and the earth. You will find a new way to read that line and you'll never be able to unknow it. So those are the two things that I promise you at the end of 45 minutes you will have. But now let's start with some fun stuff. Rabbi Ziv introduced me. I talked about Rabbi Steinberg. I don't know if you can see all of us in your Zoom windows, but you know, generally speaking, what we look like. And I feel safe in saying that if I was in a line next to Rabbi Ziv and Rabbi Steinberg, everyone here would be able to say, ah, that is three men. What's interesting about that is that I don't look like Brian Ziv at all. I mean, we have some similarities, and neither of us looks like Rabbi Steinberg. We're certainly not identical, but nonetheless, everyone would be able to say, ah, that's three men. Likewise, if I put three women in a line, by and large, they would not look like one another. Even if there were identical twins, there would still be slight differences. And yet, most people would be able to look and say, ah, that's three women. Another example. Last night, I did what I'm guessing a lot of Jews did. I went to the supermarket to buy flowers for Shabbat. And I went to the section of the supermarket that was for flowers. And I would have identified all the things there as flowers. But they were all very different. The alstroemeria were different from the Gerber daisies, which were different from the roses and the tulips and so on and so forth. But I said, yeah, those are all flowers. And then, by the way, if I looked just at the tulips, There were red tulips and yellow tulips and purple tulips. And then even among the yellow tulips, there were yellow tulips that looked this way and yellow tulips that looked that way. But in any case, I'm able to look at the collection and say flowers, tulips, yellow tulips, and group things together, even though those things are different. That, in a nutshell, is the very earliest philosophical problem that the philosophers of ancient Greece tried to deal with, which is to say, the problem of what are called universals. How is it that we're faced with a barrage of different things that we see in our world, and yet we're able to make sense of it by placing it into categories? Man, woman, flower, chair, stool, door. And then, by the way, also things that might not be material: courage, bravery, beauty, the good. We call different things courageous or good or beautiful. They're not the same thing, and yet our mind is able to understand them as universal things that have different expressions. So this is a major philosophical problem that began as early as Plato in the 4th century BCE and continues all the way down to present day. So we could do a philosophical discussion and talk about how every philosopher since the beginning of philosophical discussion has dealt with the problem of universals. I assure you that would bore the Billy Dickens out of you. So we're only going to talk about one philosopher because this is the philosopher that first dealt with the problem of universals in a significant way and created a solution that would have a lasting impact on both Judaism and Christianity. And as you can imagine, that figure was Plato. So how did Plato solve the problem of universals? He solved the problem of universals by proposing what he called the world of forms. So here's what Plato said. We live in our world. You could call it Earth. He only knew of Earth. We know of Earth and galaxies, our material universe, everything we know of. That's our physical world. And it's made up of matter, stuff. And he said, in parallel to our world, there is another world. And in that other world are all of the ideas or all of the forms of the things that are in our world. But in the world of forms, or the Platonic world, or the world of ideas, those all refer to the same thing. Nothing is material. Everything is immaterial, just an idea. So in this world, we have men. But in the ideal world, there is the perfect ideal man. We have women, the ideal woman in the world of forms. We have chairs, the ideal chair is in the world of forms. And I could go on and on explaining all of the objects in our world and all of the ideal forms that are therefore in the Platonic world of forms. Now, what is the difference between, say, me, I'm a man, and the ideal form of man that is in the world of forms? Well, because I am made of matter, I can never be a perfect replica of the immaterial form of man. So everything you recognize in the world as a man, you recognize because it resembles the ideal form of man, but it is lesser, it is a shadow, it is a replica of the ideal man. And if it stops resembling the ideal man enough for you to recognize it as a man, you might think of it as something different. Giraffe, woman, alarm clock, I don't know, it doesn't matter, right? So why is it then that men look different? Well, because they participate or they resemble the ideal man to different degrees. So for example, Brad Pitt might resemble the ideal man 99% of the way. And that's why he's such a man. Whereas poor old schlubby me, maybe I'm rocking 80%. So yeah, you can tell I'm a man, but I'm not Brad Pitt man. But this goes over very well with undergraduates, by the way. But if you get low enough down, you might look and say, is that actually a man? And you can apply this same thinking in Plato's philosophy to anything. You can apply it to, for example, cats. In the ideal world, there is the ideal form of a cat. But as soon as a cat becomes material and exists in our world, you have cats with spots, you have cats that are black, cats that are white, all kinds of different cats. And the reason why you recognize them as cats in our world is because in some way they are a replica of the true perfect cat that only exists in the world of forms. And you could do that with dogs. There is an ideal dog. All the dogs you know on earth are replicas of that ideal dog. You could do it with horses. And again, you could do it with any perceptible object in our world, or you could do it with ideas that are in our world. Courage is a great example. We might find Rosa Parks. We would say, wow, Rosa Parks had a tremendous amount of courage because she sat on a bus. We might also say the firefighters on 9/11 have a tremendous amount of courage because they ran into a building with hoses. Right? Two totally different people at totally different times doing totally different things, and yet we say that's courage. Well, the reason is because our minds are able to understand what true courage is, and therefore we can see replicas of it on Earth. So that, in a nutshell, is how Plato solved the problem of universals. There is a true world of forms that is different than our world. Our world has material replicas of that ideal world, and we can recognize in those replicas the ideal world. Plato expressed this very famously in a metaphor that you may have learned in middle school or high school or college, which for some of us was a long time ago. Let me review that famous metaphor, which is known as the metaphor of the cave. So if you're ever reading Plato's Republic, which I'm sure you do on a routine basis, you might come across his description of this cave. I find it easier to Google image Plato's metaphor of the cave and show you this fabulous image, which describes to a T the way Plato understands knowledge. Now, it's a bizarre metaphor, so you'll have to bear with me for a moment. Plato said, imagine a bunch of people who were taken prisoner at the time of their birth, and they were placed on these chairs and locked down. So the only thing they have ever experienced is the screen that is in front of them inside the cave. Now, behind the cave is a fire, and in between the fire and the people are a bunch of other people who are holding up wooden or cardboard cutouts of various objects. So you see their cat and table and chair. And Plato said what would happen is that on the screen in front of these prisoners, there would be a shadow of a cat, a shadow of a table, and a shadow of a chair. Now, these people behind the prisoners were apparently jerks also. So they would not only hold up these cutouts, they would also make noises like meow and scratch, scratch, scratch. And so they would act out a drama with a cat jumping on a table and on a chair. And the prisoners would see this and they would think that what a real cat is the shadow of a cat that makes the meow sound. What Plato argues is that if the prisoners were ever freed and they looked back, at first they would be blinded, but then they would slowly see, oh my goodness, this cat and table and chair on the right of the screen, that's not a real cat and chair and table. A real cat, chair, and table are the cardboard cutouts. Now, of course, we know better than that if they were then able to get out of the cave, at first the light would blind them, and then they would see on Earth a real live cat and a real table and a real chair. And they would say, oh my goodness, that's what a real cat and chair and table are. And of course, Plato would say, no. That too is just a replica, just a shadow. the only way to gain a true understanding of what cat, chair, and table are to understand the perfect form of those objects, which exists only immaterially in the Platonic world of forms. Now, I mentioned that I got this on Google Images. I also found while I was there one that I think is more appropriate for a Southern California audience. So this is the film industry giving us Black Widow and the Hulk and a helicopter making an action movie. And there we are as the dumb crowd just watching the shadows on the screen. But it's the same metaphor. We could do the same thing. But I wonder if this is also making a subtle comment about the relationship between cinema and reality, and the way some of us who fashion our own understanding of the world based on the cinema are actually not encountering reality. That's a sermon that your rabbis can give you. I'm just showing you that because I think it's a neat image that is related to Plato's metaphor of the cave. So before I move on, I want to make sure that we all understand the way Plato solves the problem of the universals, that there are two worlds: a Platonic immaterial world that has the pure form of everything, and our world, which is subordinate, material, and has only replicas of various levels of quality, replicas of the ideal world of forms. So I can only see some of you, but if there are questions, maybe you could put it in the chat, or just say that you want to talk in the chat. I'll wait 3 seconds, and if I don't see anything in the chat, I will press on. 3, 2, 1. Wonderful. How did this whole situation come to be? In other words, if someone were to ask Plato, oh, we have these two totally discrete worlds, how did that happen? In a dialogue called the Timaeus, you may know that Plato wrote the Republic, which is a long treatise, but also most of Plato's work are dialogues in which there's a guy named Socrates, and he says, oh, hey, buddy, I'm walking down the street. Do you think you know what the good is? And then some poor schmo says, oh, yeah, I know what the good is. And then Socrates interviews this person for 30 pages, and we realize that the guy actually has no idea what the good is. That's a Platonic dialogue. So there's one that's called the Timaeus. And in the Timaeus, Plato actually gives us an idea about how he thinks our world came to be. It's his version of Genesis. How did creation happen? And Plato says the way it happened, is that there was a demiurgos in Greek, a demiurge, which is a fancy Greek word for a craftsman, a carpenter, some kind of deity who liked to make things. And he said, this deity, this craftsman, looked at the Platonic world and said, wow, look at all those, or maybe not even looked in the way like you see material things, but conceptualized the Platonic world. Wow, the immaterial form of man and woman and planet and dirt and house and cat and dog and aardvark. I want to make that. I want to be able to see it and feel it and touch it. So the demiurge conceptualized the ideal world and then made it into a physical reality. What's the problem? When you are an artist or a craftsman, you might have an idea in your head of what something ought to be when you create it, but when that idea is forced to inhere in matter, it never is quite the same as you imagined it in your mind. Now, I have a couple of funny anecdotes which I think articulate and describe this problem nicely. One is me in 10th grade ceramics class. I'm not very artistic. We had to create a bust like a clay bust. And I had kind of a liking for a girl in the class, so I thought I would impress her by making a bust of her. Again, I'm not very artistic. I'll make a very long story short by telling you that I did not go to the junior prom with this young lady because my bust was not very impressive. And in fact, it offended her greatly. Now, my inspiration to do that came from a music video that those of you who are millennials might recognize. The bust was indeed a bust, Laura. Thank you for helping me. The next time I give a lecture like this, I'll have the perfect line. Another time someone made a bust, and it wasn't a bust, is in the music video you may have seen with Lionel Richie, one of my heroes in the 1980s. Apparently, there's a singer called Adele today. I don't know anything about that. And she has a song called Hello. I'm upset by that because the true song Hello is Lionel Richie from the mid 1980s. And he made a video of it in which he was a drama teacher at a college for the arts. And he had a student, which you can see in the lower left. She was blind. And he had a big crush on her. And he would like follow her around the college and call her at night and saying, hello, is it me you're looking for? Okay. And in the video, what we don't know is that the whole time in ceramics class, this blind woman is making a bust of Lionel Richie. So at the very end of the video, we see that what she created is that bust on the bottom right. Here's what Plato would say. That bust is a poor replica of the real Lionel Richie. But our Lionel Richie that we love and admire here on earth is but a replica of pure Lionel Richie-ness that exists in the world of forms. And the way creation happened is that the Demiurge looked to the world of forms and created an inferior alternative that we now inhabit. So that is Plato's theory of creation expressed in the Timaeus. Now we get to the payoff for Jews and Christians. Imagine you are a first century Jew. You've read Genesis. You went to Sunday school in Alexandria, and they taught you there is one God, and that God created the world in 6 days, and so on and so forth. But then you were also a nice, rich Jew in Alexandria, so your parents paid for you to get philosophical and rhetorical training. And you were taught in philosophy class, no. There's a demiurge, and then there's the world of forms, and then there's our world, and the Timaeus explains how that came about. Well, just like many of our students who are educated at university today have a crisis of faith, so too many Jewish Platonists had a crisis of faith because they said, wait a minute, I'm a Jew. There aren't two worlds and a demiurge in between them. There's one God and one physical world. So how is it if I am a Jew and a Platonist in the first century that I can understand a world in which Genesis is right, my Sunday school teachers are right, and also Plato is right? There is a solution. And the solution, which if we had more time, I might try to suss out, I will just tell you. The solution for many Jews and Christians who also wanted Plato to be right was to say that God, obviously, is the demiurge or the craftsman. What then is the Platonic world of forms? Well, remember that in Plato's Timaeus, the demiurge conceptualizes the world of forms before creating the world. So for these ancient Jewish and Christian Platonists, the world of forms was simply inserted into the mind of the demiurge. The world of forms becomes God's mind. Therefore, you can have God and a world, just like Genesis. But you can also have God and a world of forms as long as you conflate them and make Plato's world of forms God's mind. And so what we're going to see in the next 20 minutes is the way different Jews and Christians articulated the notion that the world of forms is actually the God of Israel's mind. So what does that look like? Well, first I want to show you the most famous of the first century Alexandrian Jewish philosophers, exactly what I described before. A rich kid who went to synagogue and learned all about Genesis, but then also went to the equivalent of, I was going to say Harvard Westlake. I don't know what the equivalent is in Orange County. I'm sure they have them. Some fancy schmancy private school where he learned rhetoric and philosophy. And he said, well, Plato's right and Genesis is right. So how do I understand creation? And here's what he produced. Now, this is really complicated. I'm going to read through it in English and it might not make sense. Then I'll explain what he's really saying. So what Philo says in his work, De Opificio Mundi, which in Latin means on the creation of the world, he says the following. God, as apprehending beforehand that there could not exist a good imitation without a good model, and that of the things perceptible to the external senses, nothing could be faultless, which wax not fashioned with reference to some archetypal idea conceived by the intellect. When God had determined to create this visible world, previously formed that one which is perceptible only by the intellect, in order that, so using an incorporeal model formed as far as possible on the image of God, God might then make this corporeal world a younger likeness of the elder creation, which should embrace as many different genera perceptible to the external senses as the other world contains of those which are visible only to the intellect. I watched a movie last weekend, forget what it was called, but in the final scene, like 100 people's heads exploded. It was some action movie. I forget what it was called. This is what I feel like when I'm reading this. And this was on my Greek exam when graduate school. And that was a year of my life wasted. In any case, what he's saying here is actually pretty simple. Before God decided to create the world, God thought of what the world would be like beforehand, right? God said, this is the world that I'm going to create. Okay, I've got it down. Boom, let's do it. And that's Genesis 1:1. Well, there's something that's comparable to that. He says, so how was it created? Well, we'll understand what I'm talking about if we take for our guide a certain image of the things which exist among us. When any city is founded through the exceeding ambition of some king or leader who lays claim to absolute authority, and is at the same time a man of brilliant imagination, eager to display his good fortune, then it happens at times that some man coming up who, from his education, is skillful in architecture, and he, seeing the advantageous character and beauty of the situation, first of all sketches out in his own mind nearly all the parts of the city which is about to be completed. The temples, the gymnasia, the Prytania, and the markets, the harbor, the dock, the streets, the arrangement of the walls, the situation of the dwelling houses, and of the public and other buildings. In other words, you just bought a fancy piece of land in Irvine, California, and you hire an architect. And you say, all right, I want you to build me a beautiful home in Irvine. Well, what's the first thing the architect does? The architect imagines in her mind, this is what the upstairs is going to look like, and the downstairs, and the pool, and the bar, and the nursery, and so on and so forth. What's the next thing the architect does? Normally when I'm teaching this, I get answers from the crowd. That's too hard to do on Zoom, but I assume you all know the next thing the architect does is she draws up blueprints. So then, having received in his own mind, as on a waxen tablet, the form of each building, he carries in his heart the image of a city, perceptible as yet only by the intellect, the image of which he stirs up in memory, which is innate in him, and still further engraving them in his mind like a good workman, Keeping his eyes fixed on his model, he begins to raise the city of stones and wood, making the corporeal substances to resemble each of the incorporeal ideas. In other words, an architect starts with a vision in her mind, then creates blueprints, and then the blueprints are converted into the creation. Now we must form a similar opinion of God, who, having determined to found a mighty state, first of all conceived its form in God's mind, according to which God made a world perceptible only by the intellect, and then completed only one visible to the external senses, using the first one as a model. So just as for Plato in the Timaeus, a craftsman conceptualizes the world of forms and creates our world, so the God of Israel, according to Philo, had the world of forms in God's mind, created the world of forms in God's mind, and then out of that world of forms, created the world, as in Genesis chapter 1. So Philo achieves a certain harmony between the idea of Plato and the idea of Genesis. There were other Jews in the 1st and 2nd century. They are the ones who gave us the Mishnah and the Talmud. They were called the rabbis. Now, the rabbis were not nearly as philosophically sophisticated as someone like Philo, but the ideas of Philo were so enmeshed, if that's a word, in the culture of the ancient Mediterranean world that the rabbis too, we will see, incorporated Plato's idea into their own understanding of creation. And I'm going to show that to you in one of the most famous rabbinic passages, a rabbinic passage in which the rabbis are talking about Genesis. I promise English is coming. The rabbis discuss Genesis chapter 1 in a midrash on Genesis that is known as Genesisrama. So this is the first chapter of that huge commentary on Genesis called Genesisrama. And it starts b'noheg sheba olam, which in English means, in mundane terms, in how the world works, a human king who builds a palace does not build it from his own mind, but rather he employs an architect. Same thing Philo said. Nor does the architect build it from his own mind, but rather he has inks and tablets, blueprints, to know where he should put the rooms and the gates and so on and so forth. So far in this interpretation of the rabbis, you can see they're going in the same direction as Philo. To understand how God created the world, you need to understand God as an architect. God developed an idea, God drew the blueprints in God's mind, and then created. But here's where it gets awesome. Because for the rabbis, it's not Plato's world of forms that is in God's mind. What is in God's mind? Well, here's where it's going to get a little tricky, but I promise you the payoff is good. For the rabbis, in order to understand what was in God's mind, you need to move on from Genesis, past Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. You need to get out of the Torah, past Joshua and Judges, and through the prophets, all the way to the book of Proverbs, one that not a lot of Jews know well because it's not even among the 5 scrolls that are recited on the festivals. So a somewhat unknown book for most Jews. But nonetheless, Proverbs chapter 8 has one of the neatest chapters in all of the Hebrew Bible. Because in Proverbs 8, there is a female character whose name is Chokhmah, or wisdom. In the Greek translation, her name is Sophia. And wisdom is countered with another female character in the earlier chapters of Proverbs, whose name is Folly. And Folly is this terrible woman, and she'll cause you to have problems, and she'll ruin your marriage, and she's just terrible. But she's contrasted with wisdom in chapter 8. And wisdom says, I'm great, you should learn me, and so on and so forth. And at one point in her monologue, wisdom says, the Lord brought me forth as the first of his works, Before his deeds of old, I was formed long ages ago at the very beginning when the world came to be. In other words, what wisdom seems to say in Proverbs chapter 8 is, I was the first thing that God created. Before God created even heaven and earth, light and dark, vegetables, the first thing God created was me, wisdom. Now, for the rabbis, what is the embodiment of wisdom? How do we understand what wisdom is on earth? Well, for the rabbis, there's one place you go if you want to gain wisdom: the Torah. For the rabbis, wisdom and Torah are the same exact thing. So the rabbis say, wisdom says she was the first thing created. That must mean Torah was the first thing created. Now, even better, this first line here that says, the Lord brought me forth as the first of his creations. I didn't highlight this, but if you look, you can see it down here. If you see my arrow, according to Proverbs, Adonai Kanani Reshit Darko. So wisdom says, I was the first thing that was created. And the word that's used for first in Proverbs chapter 8 is Reshit, first. So wisdom says, I was created first. And the rabbis say, Torah was created first. And Torah is identified as Reshit. Now, Reshit should sound familiar because that's also the first word of the Torah. Bereshit, bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. So this midrash concludes by saying, God did exactly what a builder would do. God looked into the Torah and created the world. In other words, the blueprints that were in God's mind was the Torah. Genesis 1:1 says, Bereshit, not at first, but using the first thing, God created the heavens and the earth, using Reshit. And what is Reshit? Reshit means wisdom or the Torah. Just as you read in Proverbs, the Lord created me first, Reshit of his work. So I realize this is complicated, but what the rabbis are saying is that Bereshit bara Elohim, the first line of the Torah, should not be read, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. It should be read, using the Torah, God created the heavens and the earth. And the connection is the word Reshit between Genesis 1 and way down there in Proverbs 8, in which eternal wisdom says, I was the first thing made, and I'm called Reshit. Now, there is the link, Reshit and Reshit, Reshit and Reshit. I don't know if any of you ever came to hear Rabbi Ziv's fifth year sermon at HUC, or for any other reason you've been to the Jack H. Skirball campus of the Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles. But if you do, you will see that our ark, where our Torah is kept, looks like this. And you can see that it's a bunch of garbled Hebrew letters and apparently some pomegranate trees. And out of it, it says, Adonai Kanani Reshit Darko. It's that exact verse from Proverbs 8 saying, God created me first in God's ways. You will only know why that makes sense if you know this passage from Genesisrama. Oh, God created me first of his ways. That's in Proverbs, where Proverbs has wisdom or Torah saying, look, I was the first thing created. And there is the link to Genesis, Reshit. So I don't know who made this ark, but it was a person who understood the Jewish textual tradition very well. But again, this is simply the rabbis figuring out how to incorporate Plato in a rabbinic way. Yes, God had the world of forms in God's mind, but it wasn't the world of forms, it was the Torah. I want to show you one last passage, because if a Jewish philosopher imagines the world of forms in God's mind, and the rabbis imagine Torah in God's mind, what do you think Christians are going to imagine is in God's mind? Well, in the very famous prologue to the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, something you may have heard. By the way, one of my most favorite stories about this, and I don't know if it's true, but a hero of mine, Oscar Wilde, was apparently at his interview to get into Oxford. And back then, you had to know Greek and Latin to get into Oxford. So they gave you a little Greek and Latin test. And his Greek test, I think, was the prologue to the fourth gospel of the New Testament, the Gospel of John. And he started reading, and he was like, "Anarche, logos," and he was just reading beautifully. And they said, "Oh, all right, Oscar, I apologize for not doing an Irish accent." They said, "All right, Oscar, that's good enough. You clearly know Greek." And Oscar Wilde apparently said, no, let me keep reading. I want to know how it finishes," which is wonderfully Oscar Wilde. What does it say? In the beginning was the Word, the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. Now, in the philosophical tradition of Philo, remember when I said that Philo argued that the world of forms was in God's mind? The word Philo used in Greek to describe the world of forms is the word logos. Everybody in the ancient world who was in the Jewish and Christian realm philosophically understood that the world of forms as it existed in God's mind was the logos. So the author of the Gospel of John, he knows sort of pop philosophy of the day, and he says, yeah, when God created the world, alongside God, God had an idea or a thought, and that thought was the logos, and God used the logos to create the world. Of course, what makes Christianity remarkable is that it said the logos that was in God's mind became flesh and dwelt among us. And of course, that is the way Christians describe Jesus of Nazareth, the Christ. So the point I'm trying to make is that Philo and the rabbis and the author of the Gospel of John, they were all thinking about Plato and trying to figure out, how did the world come to be if Genesis is right and Plato is right? And the way Jews and Christians solved it was to say that the world of forms was just inside God's mind. And for Philo, that meant, yeah, the actual Platonic world of forms was in God's mind, and he called it the Logos. For Genesisrama and the rabbis, it wasn't called the Platonic world of forms, called the Torah. And for the Gospel of John, it wasn't called the Platonic world of forms or the Torah, it was called Christ. But again, they're all solving the same problem, just in their unique way, based on what they think the ultimate form of wisdom is. So that's the end of my presentation, but I'm more than happy to stick around as long as people like in order to ask any questions, make any comments, and so on and so forth. Brian, go ahead.
Well, you have quite a few in the chat. The minds were blown for sure when you started with the Reshit conversation. I'll just say thank you for this presentation, Dr. Garroway. This just makes me miss spending an hour and 20 minutes with you literally twice a week for years. I mean, this was fascinating, and I love every second of this. So if you want to check out the chat, there's some good stuff.
Hold on, let me just, all right. Well, why doesn't, all right, I'll try to pull up chat. I saw, I mean, a number of, can I please talk about the tree of knowledge? I mean, I don't know in what respect. Obviously, the rabbis have a lot to say about the tree of knowledge, as do Christians who use it to ultimately develop a concept of original sin. Um, yeah, I'm not sure I can incorporate it into what I just discussed above. Is that how we get the word logo to represent a real object? I'm not sure what you, Deborah, if you could unmask yourself. I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Question is that when we use a logo as a business,
Oh,
like, or Shir HaMalot has the menorah, which is a logo. It isn't really the synagogue, but it represents our look, our feel, our expression of a lot of things that we have at the synagogue. So is that where we get the word and we use it in this way? Because we're taking something that is an idea and it's represented one way, but the form is physical building and the form is the people inside the physical building?
it may be. I mean, that's a question that a modern 20th century linguist would probably be able to answer better. I can just tell you that I'm certain that the word logo, like all the words that we think of with that have leg or lek or log, come from the Greek word logos, which means word. By the way, election comes from logos because ek lego is to choose out. But you know, there's just so many words, and there's no way logo doesn't come from logos. But I don't know if the person who first used it was actually thinking that elaborately about the relationship between reality and the word. I don't know.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead. Sandra.
Yes. Shabbat shalom to everybody.
Shabbat shalom.
So I teach first grade and I teach Torah. So do I, and I would ask any of the rabbis this question, now do I say that first the Torah was created and from the Torah we go through until we get to Shabbat?
I don't know if that's a question for me. I would suggest that early on in teaching children, it would be worthwhile for them to appreciate the manifold possibilities for interpreting just about everything that is in the Torah. Indeed, I can't imagine a Reform community surviving if that's not the case, because so much of the Torah taken literally would be detrimental to our ideals as Reform Jews.
Of course, yeah, indeed.
I don't think the first line of creation is a problem, but if you set the stage for saying, look, there's a lot of ways that in the beginning God created the heaven and earth can be understood. And by the way, it's not just the alternatives are, you know, read it literally or read it the way I just proposed. There's like 10 possibilities. You could even encourage them to come up with their own possibilities. And by doing so, you would be impressing upon them, I think, the importance of interpreting the legitimacy of different readings and different interpretations of the Torah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you for today.
It's my pleasure.
Another interesting question that I saw here. If the Eternal visualized the world and created it, how is it imperfect?
Oh, because as soon as you try to put something into matter, right, matter corrupts things. That's a basic premise of Plato. It would become a basic premise of Gnosticism, if you know what that is, basic premise of Jewish mysticism, that something can be perfect and immutable as long as it is immaterial. But as soon as you make it material, it is subject to decay and so on and so forth. If you just think about human beings, if there is an ideal human form, that's great. But as soon as you make it material, it gets sick and it dies and it falls apart and so on and so forth. Or the ideal apple. Right? As soon as the ideal apple is material, it's subject to rot. And so you may know that one of the reasons why mystical movements, which often are very similar to Platonism, so mystical movements like Kabbalah in Judaism or Gnosticism in an early Christian realm, they are often anti-material, right? They are ascetic. They reject the world and matter and physical pleasure, because the idea is that matter is inherently evil. There's actually been a lot written about how that was possibly, and what's the right way of putting it? That's a fundamental idea in the development of Christianity, is a rejection of the physical world, which is why by the way monasticism was quite popular in early Christianity in a way that it never was in Judaism, because Judaism, on the contrary, embraced the physical world and created halakha. Said, yeah, you actually come close to God not by denying physical reality and trying to exist in some spiritual state in a monastery. You encounter God by actually walking through life, by living Jewish law. That is the physical encounter with God that Judaism emphasized. And so there's actually a lot more discussion that could blossom out of this idea.
Well, Dr. Garroway, I was going to ask a question I would have never asked in rabbinical school, but you just answered it, and that is, what's the nechemta? In other words, what's the message for the Orange County Reformed Jew in 2021? And I think you just answered it so beautifully, of how we translate wisdom and this idea of God's presence into everyday life, as opposed to just philosophy and theology, but something that's alive and well and living today. So I really appreciate that so very much.
It's my pleasure.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Garroway. It was really here. Stop sharing your screen.
Oh, did I not do that?
No, that's okay. If you,
I'm sorry. I can.
Yeah, there you go. Now we can see each other.
But now my head's so big and it frightens me, so I'm gonna.
Thank you so
switch
very
to Gala.
much.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.